1790, Flemish engraver Theodore de Brie worked with Reverend Richard Hakluyt to produce a new edition of Thomas Harriot's A Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia, appended with John White's drawings. Published as the first volume of de Brie's America series, it emphasized the ethnographic elements of Harriot's discourse, whereas the original had focused on the commercial resources available. Of the 75 watercolors White had completed by 1588, most of which had depicted flora and fauna, de Brie and Hakluyt selected 25 images of Algonquians, their villages, and their religions and subsistence practices to render into copperplate illustrations. This selective visual portrayal foregrounded metals in the narrative. Harriot's accompanying captions related the importance of copper as a marker of status among Eastern Algonquians, while simultaneously pointing out the absence of edge tools and other utilitarian metal objects in their societies. For most of us, the story of English early colonization and the history of metals within it is a search for mines. This was, of course, one of the primary attractions for the English to settle on the mid-Atlantic coast. They had heard from the Spanish and French about a rich kingdom thought to be located in what is today the Southern Appalachians. As the Roanoke colony surveyor, Thomas Harriot participated in explorations for copper and silver mines and reported on their presence allegedly about 150 miles up the Roanoke River, not far from a copper belt in what is today the Virgilina district. The presence of copper, whose ores often contained gold and silver, lent credence to rumors of an Appalachian El Dorado. Yet historians' emphasis on precious metals obscures the significance of base metals like copper and iron and the everyday objects made from them in forging and fracturing early Anglo-Algonquian relationships. Metals were not just what they sought in the New World. They were both a material foundation for the English Empire and objects embedded with cultural and religious meaning that helped define the ideology of English imperialism. Metals shaped how the English thought about and perceived their world, and they enabled some actions while they interfered with or obstructed others. Usually, metals did this invisibly, that is, until they didn't work the way they were expected to, or, as in the case of Algonquians, they were not used or appreciated as the English did. In these moments, metals became meaningful things to express moral, philosophical, and political concepts, and prompted contradictory evaluations about the New World and the people in it. These disagreements over the function and value of metals allow historians a window into how the material and immaterial interacted with and reproduced each other to support English expansion. So today I'd like to offer two propositions. The first is that metals defined the material conditions for humanity's salvation in the English understanding of prophetic history. These preconceptions legitimized England's conquest of North America as a benevolent overlordship to advance Algonquian society by introducing European arts and technologies for which mined metals were necessary. The second is that the English envisioned commerce as a way to reclaim and recuperate Algonquians by friendship rather than through violence and enslavement, as they accused the Spanish of doing. Religion was not merely a moral cliché to validate English colonial and commercial ambitions. It was deeply implicated in them. The de Brie edition of Harriot's text offers a particularly fertile ground to think about English assessments of their place in prophetic history and where Algonquians fit into it. It reads like an emblem book with text and titles and illustrations working together to promote international Protestantism. Algonquians' preference for base copper over precious gold and silver reminded English readers that they too had once benefited from the Roman conquest to civilize them. Ancient Britons, as the story went, had settled down to agriculture with the plow and animal husbandry. They had circulated coins for commerce, and they were converted from pagan religions to Christianity after the Romans subjugated them and imposed, quote, good governance. As Europe's foremost Protestant state, men like Hakluyt believed that God had specially chosen the English to do the same for Virginia's native inhabitants. He viewed Harriot's relation as a way to convince his compatriots to take up their providential role in redeeming Algonquians for the final age of history, the fifth kingdom of God. The main avenue to achieve this transformation would be the exchange of metalware in return for information about gold and silver mines, lucrative commodities, and dominion over the land. Basically, they hoped to give brass for gold, to use an English phrase applied to both unequal commercial transactions and also moral redemption. So I want to take you back to a time when Europeans conceived of the natural world in very different terms than we do today. In many ways, how the English saw nature and the presence of the divine within it was not so different from the Algonquians that they encountered. Early modern Europeans thought of metals as spirited things that had the same spark of life as plants, animals, and humans. Like plants, metals germinated from elemental seeds and would eventually ripen from the basis of metals like lead, iron, tin, and copper into noble silver and gold. Roger Bacon, the famed medieval natural philosopher and alchemist, said, quote, "Nature always intendeth and striveth to the perfection of gold." How long this process took, decades, centuries, millennia, depended upon subterranean conditions like temperature, moisture levels, and vapors that introduced impurities that had to be purged. This theory of metallic generation helped natural philosophers and miners explain the occurrence of gold and silver in iron, copper, lead, tin, and antimony ores, and the relative rarity of pure deposits. So as you can see, we have our vegetable minerals growing like trees. And they did literally describe them like trees and veins and things like that. After the fall, God had given humans reason to discover the secrets of nature's operations so they could redeem terrestrial matter from its corrupted state. Metallurgists used their smelting and refining techniques to make metals the most perfect in their current condition, while alchemists accelerated their development into perfect silver and gold in a laboratory. As an imitation of God's divine work, early modern thinkers saw correspondences between the bodily and moral regimens needed for salvation and metallurgical and alchemical operations. This wasn't a great leap to make. The Bible is full of descriptions of salvation as the refining furnace, and the comparisons of humanity's propensity for sin and hubris to refractory metal, notable in terms like iron-heartedness or the Pharaoh's infamous hard-heartedness. Redemption was, therefore, a chemical reduction to a pure physical and spiritual state, whether by hammering, tempering, or the fire of tribulation. Of this work of divine alchemy, it's said in Isaiah, quote, "For brass I will bring gold, and for iron I will bring silver, and for wood brass, and for stones iron," unquote. 16th century commentators added a mercantile interpretation to this particular verse, suggesting God had accepted a grossly unequal bargain in the exchange of mortal bodies of brass for an immortal unitary body-soul of gold. In English colonial propaganda, the language of reduction became the predominant metaphor for civilizing and converting indigenous people, and commercial exchange its chief method. So the expansion of European trade into Asia, Africa, and the Americas stimulated new conversations about historical cycles and the stages of social development in what would anticipate Adam Smith's stadial theory in the 18th century. English promotional writers drew on a reservoir of classical and biblical theories of history to support either declensionist or progressive views about English and Algonquian societies. A consistent theme in these ages of humanity was their association with metals, with each age declining in preciousness and softness to become baser and harder. From the classical world, Ovid's Four Ages of Man was the most influential. His pessimistic account of a decadent human history began with a golden age of peace, natural abundance, and perpetual springtime. This eventually gave way to a silver age of 4 seasons, which required houses to protect from the elements and agriculture to make the land productive in shorter growing periods. A Bronze Age of warfare followed, during which the first laws were passed to restrain people's wickedness, and finally we reached the current depraved Iron Age. According to Ovid, mining and commerce then emerged as, quote, "the spurs and stirrers unto vice." He was not very complimentary about miners. This version of history was used to exhort moral living in the present to hopefully bring about a return of that golden age. The book of Genesis harmonized with this schema of historical decline. According to the Bible, following Adam and Eve's initial golden age spent as gatherers in the Garden of Eden, subsequent generations after the fall developed various aspects of civilization as the gap between their mortal bodies and immortal souls widened, and life became nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes has put it. Cain and Abel created tillage and pastoralism. Enoch built the first permanent dwellings and towns. and Jubal and Tubal-Cain created music and metallurgy to provide the necessities for civil human life. However, a strain of medieval millenarianism prophesied that after a period of cataclysmic disruptions, which Protestants and Catholics alike would interpret as the schism in the church, humanity could recover their first age's virtues. Though they were the product of the fall from grace, arts and commerce offered people the tools to ameliorate their corporeal condition and concentrate on spiritual redemption. Properly regarded, base metals reclaimed mankind from bestial living. They equipped them with tools for agriculture, fishing, masonry, carpentry, cloth making. They made vessels and utensils, and the ingredients for dyes and medicines, among other uses. In other words, the advance of civilization was a revolution of prophetic history dependent upon mining. With gains in knowledge and skills, people approached the divine in anticipation of this new heavenly kingdom and the restoration of their prelapsarian state. Metals and their functions thus became an index for the relative primitivity or civility of a society. Protestants especially latched on to Daniel's prophecy of the four monarchies, as they could use it to contest the universal imperium of the Pope. Soon after the fall of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar dreamt of a body with a head of gold, a breast of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet of mixed iron and clay. A stone struck this body down by smashing its feet, and then the stone turned into a great mountain covering the earth. Daniel interpreted this vision to foretell four monarchies, the Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman, before Christ, the cornerstone of the true church, returned to inaugurate a fifth monarchy of peace and plenty that would last 1,000 years. Protestants said the mixed feet of clay and iron represented the cleavage of the Christian church after 1517. For English colonial promoters, this theory of history likewise challenged the legal basis of the papal donations that had granted Spain and Portugal exclusive dominion over the Americas. If England was to usher in this fifth monarchy, then Protestants needed to reunite humanity, including Algonquians, in a visible Reformed church. Providence not only offered the English an unimpeachable moral justification for conquest and colonization in North America, at least from their perspective, it made it a duty. The westward revolution of biblical history encompassed all aspects of society, including governance, social relations, the economy, and advances in arts, in other words, trades and sciences. Richard Eden and Francis Bacon thought the coeval discovery of the New World with the inventions of the printing press, guns, and the lodestone compasses, incidentally, all technologies dependent upon mining, was no coincidence. It was divine providence. Daniel also predicted a time when men would travel to and fro, expanding the bounds of knowledge, which in Bacon's view referred to the early modern era's expansion of trade and empires into the Americas. Significantly, Debris mentioned in no less than 3 places the skill and difficulty of engraving copper plates with a burin, acids, and water for printing white images. This is in direct contrast to the ornamental plates of copper worn by Algonquian elites. In explaining his painstaking efforts, Debris declared, quote, "The figures do lively represent the form and manner," unquote, of Algonquians, suggesting the transformative nature of copperplate engraving to inscribe a mineral surface with meaning and form, as Susan Stewart has said. In an Aristotelian sense, Debris endowed the copperplate, in printmaking called a matrix, with a kind of soul, bringing his subjects to life for a readership unlikely to ever meet an actual Algonquian or to travel to Virginia. Whereas Algonquians allegedly appreciated only the copperplate's materiality, Europeans turned it into a technology for knowledge production and empire building. Algonquins' supposed inability to manifest the full potential of copper to aid human progress supported the providential nature of England's settlement in the Outer Banks and Harriot's proposal to entice them to civility and Christianity through English technology and arts. Debris' introduction to White's collection set the tone for this providential reading of Harriot's text. It opened with a depiction of Adam and Eve picking an apple from the tree of knowledge with the serpent entwined around the trunk. In the background were scenes of Algonquian life. On one side, a woman with a child in a thatched hut, and on the other side, a man tilling the topsoil with a wooden staff while deer grazed nearby. Though this image had little resemblance to actual Algonquian life, the lack of metal tools and domesticated animals suggested that their society was barely removed from humanity's origins. According to Harriot, Virginia's soil, which had never felt the plow, yielded corn, peas, and beans with little labor, and the woods had enough game to hunt as often as one desired without diminishing the stock. Algonquians, according to him, still retained a natural temperance and generosity. Harriot observed, they are very sober in their eating and drinking, and consequently very long-lived because they do not oppress nature. In comparison, too many English suffered poor health from, quote, sumptuous and unseasonable banquets, continually devising new sauces to satisfy our insatiable appetite. Algonquians were also ingenious. They used fire and tools of shell and stone to dig out canoes, devised weirs for fishing, and they made clay pots as large as copper kettles for cooking. Nonetheless, their devotion to a pagan religion had stalled their progress towards civilization and imperiled their souls. Harriot lamented that Algonquians failed to appreciate God's hand in the land's bounty or their intellectual faculties to overcome privation. Further suggesting that Algonquians still lived in a relatively pacific and uncorrupted age, debris included White's paintings of Picts to show that the ancient Britons had been more savage at the time of the Roman conquest. Scholars have long acknowledged the overt analogy debris made between Algonquians and Picts by anglicizing their faces and drawing attention to their tattoos and base metal ornaments, which indicated similar levels of social development and provoked readers' self-identification with Algonquians. The substitution of the Picts' iron swords with pike staves, iron swords and pike staves with Algonquians' wooden bows at once reflected the absence of iron metallurgy in North America, but also implied that Algonquians had not yet entered their barbaric Iron Age. The English debris implied would expend less effort to bring Algonquians under their dominion than the Romans had done with the ancient Britons or the English had lately experienced with the Irish. This, however, was not a society without violence. Like Ovid's Bronze Age counterparts, Arthur Barlow contended that there were brutal conflicts among Carolina Algonquians that had left some areas uninhabited and thus fortuitously available for English occupation. In assessing Algonquians' military capabilities, Harriot supposed they would prefer friendship with the English, quote, having no edge tools or weapons of iron and steel to offend us withal, unquote. If hostilities erupted, as they always did, Harriot had no doubt they would flee before, quote, our strange weapons and devices, especially by ordnance great and small. Harriot was optimistic the English could avert the antagonisms that had marred the first colony's last months at Roanoke, as long as they devoted themselves to paternalist policies of commerce and civil education rather than military force. Harriot thought the English should first introduce Algonquians to the book of nature, using arts and technology to give them a proper understanding of the natural world and divine creation. Then Algonquians would be made ready for the book of scripture, the revealed word of God. With their natural cleverness, Harriot predicted they would quickly appreciate how much English knowledge and crafts, quote, exceed theirs in perfection. He suggested the English could leverage Algonquian superstition and the mystery of European technologies to draw them toward Christianity. He said, most things they saw with us as mathematical instruments, sea compasses, the virtue of the lodestone in drawing iron, a perspective glass whereby was showed many strange sights, burning glasses, wild fireworks, guns, books, writing and reading, spring clocks that seemed to go of themselves, and many other things that we had, were so strange unto them that they thought they were rather the works of gods than of men, or at the leastwise they had been given and taught us of the gods. Harriot claimed that as Algonquians observed the English read and recite from their books, use their navigational instruments and weapons, and remain immune to the diseases ravaging the region, they started to doubt the efficacy of their own religion. They asked the English about their God and joined them in prayers and psalmody, supposedly showing an inclination to shed their corrupt practices for a true religion. Just as the refiner purified metal by first removing the dross and then casting it into a new form, the soul that granted man reason and the insight to comprehend the divine, Harriot envisioned teaching Algonquians trades and sciences to inculcate virtues like industriousness and obedience as a prelude to Christian conversion. In Harriot's social alchemy, Algonquians would undergo a subjection of their flesh and a purging of their native culture to be reborn as civil members of the Protestant congregation. This plan to introduce Algonquians to the use of everyday metal objects depended upon permanent settlement, which in turn required their initial goodwill and desire to interact with the English. Harriot's text assured readers that the English could effect their entry into Virginia by commerce, as Algonquians desired the metal goods they carried with them. Harriot recalled that when the settlers arrived at the Outer Banks in 1585, the Roanoke had initially seemed distressed when they saw the ships approaching, quote, making cries like wild beasts or men out of their wits, unquote. The mariners gently lured them to the boats by offering wares like glasses, knives, babies, and other trifles, which apparently put the Roanoke at ease. In exchange for their metals, the Roanoke permitted the English to encamp on the island. Arthur Barlow's reconnaissance voyage to the Outer Banks the previous year had prepared them for this interaction. About a week into their 6-week sojourn with the Roanoke, the English presented Granganameo, brother of Wingina, chief of the Roanoke, with an array of metal items, hatchets, axes, knives, a tin dish, and a copper kettle, for which they, quote, offered us very good exchange, unquote, of fish and deerskin. The copper kettle fetched 50 crowns worth of skins. Granganameo was particularly taken with a tin dish, which he exchanged for deerskins that Barlow estimated to be worth between 20 gold crowns or 20 nobles. He took the tin dish and poked a hole in it to wear over his chest, quote, making signs that it would defend him against his enemies' arrows, similarly to the metal breastplates worn by the English at this meeting, as Helen Roundtree has pointed out. He may also have regarded the metal dish as a protective talisman endowed with Manitou, a spiritual force in beings and objects, especially copper, but to a lesser degree other metals, that connected the supernatural and natural realms. What he most wanted, however, were English swords, for which he offered a great box of pearls. His brother Wingina was then recovering from serious wounds sustained in skirmishes with a rival group, and he appreciated the potential for English metals to give them an advantage in regional conflicts. The English refused this exchange, feigning disinterest in the pearls until they could learn where they came from. This was a tactic the English used to conceal their true desires from Algonquians and prevent them from setting the terms of trade and settlement that benefited them and not the English. That Algonquians would accept unequal terms was, for an English readership, additional evidence of their savagery. The English had a term for such mad exchange, a Diomedian bargain, often expressed in the shorthand of giving brass for gold or gold for brass. This came from Homer's Iliad, when Glaucus of Lycia exchanged his golden harness for the brass armor of Diomedes of Argos as a pledge of friendship. According to Homer, Zeus had addled his wits. Desiderius Erasmus called this sort of exchange a perversion of communalism and appropriate reciprocity, viewing it as evidence of Glaucus's barbarity that he would make such a foolish trade. He later dies, so I guess it wasn't so great. The English blamed Algonquians' religion, which commanded them to adorn their idols and leaders in copper and shell beads, for their improper estimation of the value of metals. Conversely, Christians recognized gold and silver as the rightful symbols of divinity and royalty. The English did not want Algonquians to learn this lesson too quickly. While the colonial project entailed teaching them to value gold and silver above base metals, the English nevertheless intended to be the beneficiaries of unequal trades to pacify and bring Algonquians under their overlordship. I'd like to end with the image of a chief's wife and daughter, which compellingly aligned the trade of metals with the civilizing mission. Copper and pearl bead necklaces on both figures indicated their high status, and the child waved a metal rattle and a toy doll brought from England. Debris engraving deviated from White's original drawing in a significant respect. White showed the child presenting her mother. If you look at it, the hand is underneath the necklace, with a European necklace of red glass beads and a copper pendant, an object that catered to Algonquian taste. In the engraving, Debris replaced it with a miniature armillary spear, one of the Queen's personal icons, and a symbol of the knowledge and technology that allowed the English to traverse the Atlantic and expand their territories. As a representation of the universe and God's power, the armillary sphere also expressed the Christian hope of salvation and resurrection, which the English insisted Algonquians could only achieve by subjection to their government. The child's enchantment with these toys mirrored the delight Algonquians took in English trinkets and the awe allegedly induced by their technology. It also presaged the colonial policy to target Native children for conversion and fostering in English households. Comparing souls to metal, the English believed that under the twin influences of culture and religion, souls hardened over time into either a pure or corrupt form. In children, the imprint of Algonquian culture and pagan religion had not yet become fixed, so they were thought to be more pliable to English influences. The souls of Algonquian adults, however, required the furnace of affliction to melt and recast them into Christians. Both versions of the image communicated the potential profits available from an Anglo-Algonquian trade, but in substituting a child's toy that represented English and Christian imperium, the engraving recommended conquest by exploiting Algonquians' interest in English material culture. When read with Harriot's text, Debris viewed this as a means to quickly subjugate Virginia's natives, especially children, and eventually transmute them into civil Christians. It was only in hindsight that Harriot imagined the English could allure Algonquians by, quote, traffic and exchange to allow the English to inhabit and plant in Virginia. During the colony's first colony's year-long existence, the Roanoke settlers didn't fully appreciate copper's significance to Algonquians, and they hadn't yet worked out how they could leverage a metallic economy in their favor. By 1602, Harriot advised Samuel Mace to carry pieces of sheet copper cut into various shapes and sizes on his voyage to locate the lost 1587 settlers and reestablish Raleigh's patent rights. The founders of Jamestown likewise brought sheet copper and various metal trade goods, which allowed them time to establish a permanent footing in the Chesapeake. But unsurprisingly, in practice, this plan did not work out as the English anticipated. After initial encounters, metal exchanges often precipitated violence when either party felt cheated in the process. At Roanoke under Wingina's leadership, and at Jamestown under Wahun Seneca's leadership, Algonquians embargoed trade with the English when they proved to be belligerent and demanding neighbors who were stingy in their reciprocation. Convinced their weapons offered a definitive advantage, the English resorted to extortion at gunpoint. After the 1622 Powhatan attack on Jamestown, the English largely abandoned Harriot's optimistic providential view to instead embrace the darker view of Canaan's conquest to justify native dispossession and genocide. In this way, metals exposed the unavoidable contradiction of benevolent conquest and the inherent violence of colonization. That's it.